Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. Today I have Zander Keig and Jason Littlefield, both of whom you've seen here before, but what you don't know is they are working together. And before I give any more introduction, we've got to know what we brought to drink to this conversation. Jason, did you bring anything?
Brought my standard
Coffee and water?
black coffee and ice water in a mason jar.
Okay. Zander?
Well, I've been drinking unsweetened iced tea like a good Southerner most of the day, but I am today drinking for this show lemon summer shandy, which is a beer that has lemonade in it. It's beautiful, very tasty.
Oh, that sounds really good. I'm doing something really special, y'all. I invented this. My husband says he did, but he lies. It is whipped cream vodka with sun-kissed soda and some half and half, and it's a creamsicle.
Oh.
It's awesome. Yep. So
Sounds good.
cheers.
I really wish they had all these wonderfully flavored vodkas when as a teenager I was stealing it from the grocery store.
I know
It tasted like rubbing alcohol, and now I can get watermelon and whipped cream. I was born in the wrong era.
Chocolate vodka. I mean, yeah, I know. Me too.
Yeah, we had schnapps, so you know.
Oh yeah, schnapps and Mad Dog 50/50. That's what
2020.
Mad Dog 2020. Mad Dog 2020. See, I can't even remember because
I know my cheap wines.
Yeah, that Boone Hill.
Boone's Farm.
See, but I think that maybe those killed some brain cells, so now I can't remember them. Boone's Farm and Mad Dog 2020.
Yeah.
All right. So Zander, we've introduced you before. You are a award-winning social worker. You have your Zander or Keig Consulting. You're now working with Jason Littlefield, and Jason we've introduced before. Jason was a former social and emotional coach at a public school and now has his own Empower Pathways, Empower Education. And you guys have come together, and what I understand, you'll have to explain it to me, is that you guys have come together around the idea of belonging. And so I really want to know what are you up to? What are you guys doing together?
We're in cahoots.
We're working to make the world a better place. But I'll kind of start off, and then I'll pass the torch to Zander as well. But essentially, what Empowered Pathways is looking to do this year is through, professional learning and coaching in the K-12 system, higher ed, and corporate training, is to address what is happening within our culture, what the impact, and I like to use Wesley Yang's expression of successor ideology. I feel that really sums up what is happening within the culture.
Can you flesh that out for people who might not have heard or that term before?
Yeah, so that just kind of encompasses, the world of intersectionality, identity politics, critical social justice, just all of that's within our culture. The Orthodox diversity, equity, and inclusion movement that's taken place. So really the large scale cultural movement is, and it's called successor ideology is because it's a new framework for, I guess, making sense of the world. And we're explaining what's happening there, the impact that the successor ideology is having on A, the individual, and B, society, including relationships. And Eric and I, we talked about, so Eric Smith is also part of our team. And last time he and I really kind of fleshed out some of our solutions and what we are proposing. So what Zander and I will be working towards is really talking about a sense of belonging, developing a professional learning series around belonging and tolerance, and also reconciliation, with that really focus on reconciliation, because the successor ideology has done a lot of damage to working groups, to communities, congregations. It's caused a permanent rift and damage, and it's harmed a lot of relationships. So we're looking to, address what's happening in the world. Here's another way of operating, and then we also want to help reconcile and repair any harm and damage that's been done within a community for the successor ideology. And that sense of belonging, one reason why we're taking it back to belonging is that's one of our ultimate human drives. uh, one of the ultimate drives is meaning making of our world. We're constantly trying to make meaning of our world. We're just primitively driven that way. And then also, we want to feel like we belong in this world. And one impact that the successor ideology is having is it is removing our sense of well-being and our way of belonging in the world. So it's ripping us apart that way. And I'm gonna drink. I'm gonna float back and forth between coffee and water, and let Zander chime in now.
Yeah, I've got questions. So Xander, if you'll elaborate on that, and then I'll hit you guys with some questions.
Well, excuse me, Jason, primarily comes from the education sector, and I'm mostly coming from corporate or healthcare, settings. And so belonging is something that you hear a lot now from HR departments. Right. So within the business world, belonging is something I read recently that they were using belonging as a term to mean that you feel safe and welcomed and celebrated in the workplace. And it's like, well, I mean, ultimately, wouldn't that be really wonderful? But that's also a lot to ask, right? Because the truest sense of the definition of belonging in that context would be that we feel acceptance as a member, right? A member of the staff, a member of the congregation, a member of the temple, a member of the neighborhood, right? We feel acceptance in that way, and so how do we accomplish that, right? That's something that we could quote unquote unpack, but this idea of some people don't feel as if they belong, and that's an internal issue that they're dealing with. Maybe it's trauma based, right? I'm a clinician, so maybe it's trauma based. Maybe it's a cognitive distortion, right? There's a negative thought or belief that people have, versus are people actually keeping them from being a member, or are they just not aspiring towards membership because they think they won't be welcome? So we have to really look at it from many different points of view, in my opinion, to really get to an understanding of what is belonging, how does one establish it, how does one feel it, how is it cultivated. These are all very different angles to look at, and they're complex. So it's not that simple to just create a belonging culture. It's like, oh well, how do we do that? What does it look like? How do we know that everybody feels like they belong? And do we really mean everybody?
Well, let me interrupt for just a second. I think one of you might have told me, isn't now, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, isn't it DEIB? Isn't it belonging added to that?
It can't, in a lot of ways, in a lot of places, they are adding belonging in, and they're not even saying DEI anymore. So the language is evolving very rapidly. DEI in some cases is almost not passe, but it's not cutting edge,
Okay.
I've started to see belonging popping up, but the thing is, and then I'm gonna pass it back to Zander, because this is one of the first, in one of our initial conversations, something that I knew Zander got like that, was that belonging in its truest and most essence, cannot exist in a world, in a society, in a working environment that operates on repressive tolerance. And that repressive tolerance is the barrier to belonging. So, also, really, to use the word unpack, to unpack that, that's something else that we do. And whenever I know, Jen, you have some questions, but I'm going to let Zander really take that repressive tolerance baton and just kind of get into what a barrier to belonging is, and people that are operating off of the orthodox diversity, equity, and inclusion, true belonging cannot exist under that framework, because that framework promotes repressive tolerance, and repressive tolerance is a rejection of human dignity, and it's also a rejection of belonging. And there's no way to have inclusion with that idea either. So that's an idea that is so strong in the ethos that it is a barrier to true belonging and true human connection. And that's one of the barriers that Xander and I hope to really break down.
So, okay, before Xander, I want you to talk about repressive tolerance. Before we do, I just want to make sure that I understand. So, are you saying that DEI has been, now the new language is belonging? So, what was DEI now is being called belonging? So, you would be going to belonging training, or is that, as a, are they
No,
synonymous?
I don't know if it's synonymous. I just know that I'm starting to see that word belonging pop up and pop up alongside of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay, so in mainstream, when you hear belonging, it typically is at least somewhat aligned with what we know of what was been called diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Okay.
I would almost think of it as it's an addendum to, or it's right. It's like, because they're working on. I think belonging is the goal of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work.
Okay.
But I think the goal of that work is seen as ending up with a culture of belonging, so that everybody feels as if they belong in the job, at the school, in the place of worship, in the neighborhood, in the organization.
If the tools that you're using are purposed for that, but what's happening in these trainings and in this idea is that the tools that are being used aren't purposed for true belonging.
I think what can happen is people can turn it into, certain groups of people have felt left out, pushed aside, marginalized, and so we're going to bring them in, and we don't care if you feel uncomfortable. We don't really care if you feel like you belong anymore. So it's not real belonging. It's akin to this repressive tolerance idea, which most people have never heard of, and most people don't really understand. And because this is a concept that was initially put forward in a book called A Critique of Pure Tolerance in 1965, in an essay, the title being Repressive Tolerance. And it was written by Herbert Marcuse, or Marcuse. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. He's a German-American philosopher, and he was associated with the Frankfurt School. And so if people are unfamiliar, these are things they can go look up. Repressive Tolerance, Herbert Marcuse, Marcuse, and the Frankfurt School. Right, and they put forward different critical theories. And so this idea of repressive tolerance is that the way it was defined in this essay in the book Critical Pure Tolerance is that it's the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly from groups and movements. Well, which groups of movements? Well, the ones that they deemed intolerant. Right, so that's how it works. It's like this idea of pure tolerance of even what the Southern Poverty Law Center, right, when they were advancing tolerance, the idea is that there's a limit to tolerance. So if there's a group of people who say, you know what, I find what you're saying intolerant, and I'm not going to tolerate that, and therefore I'm going to suppress what I deem to be intolerant. That's repressive tolerance, and it's utilized as a tool to further a movement without anybody sort of coming in and calling attention to it. Like, hey, wait a minute, that's race essentialism, or hey, wait a minute, that's a form of oppression or marginalization that targets a group of people that are now seen as not deserving of having anybody point that out. Yeah, so repressive tolerance, it's tricky, and it's not something that it's just not an idea that I think a lot of people know about and can fully understand how it works. And how it works is, if somebody is saying something that a group of people who are championing a particular affinity group right, and they hear from another group something that they don't like, they'll cancel it. That's where cancel culture comes from. Cancel culture is repressive tolerance at work, right? It's like, we don't want that speaker on campus because they say things that we don't like. And so, well, that's freedom of speech. And they'll say, that's not freedom of speech, that's hate speech. Well, there's no literal thing called hate speech in law. It just means we don't like what that person's saying, so we're going to repress it. We're going to repress them, their ideas, and their ability to express those ideas. Repressive tolerance.
And even before things escalate to the point of cancel culture, repressive tolerance also shows up in there's a great unwillingness of professionals to be able to sit down and engage in ideas. The unwillingness of people that firmly believe in the successor ideology, and people that are kind of trenched in, classical liberalism that's dominated Western society for the past 300 years. There's an unwillingness of even exchange of ideas, and
no, you can't. You can't,
good,
right? It's like,
good faith
you can't debate.
Right.
Yeah, you can't have a debate
or discuss.
You
just
can't have discussion.
But debate as well. I know that D'Angelo and Kendi, Coleman Hughes and others have really tried to say, hey, let's have some public discussion about these two ideas, and that never happens. And that's, repressive tolerance is part of that.
Yeah, because it's basically saying you have no right to have your opinion heard by the people. It is so intolerant. It is so abhorrent that nobody should have to hear it. Therefore, I'm not going to create an environment or an opportunity for you to espouse your views so that my audience can hear it.
So, okay, laying it out for our listeners, can you just give an example of what that would look like in real life? I mean, it can be a made up example, or if you've had an example that you guys have experienced personally, but what does that look like playing out in real life? What would be something that would give us that imagery?
I can say a couple of years ago, I went to some professionals in my field saying that, because I noticed that the trainings and the workshops that I was attending were rooted in Marxist philosophy. The philosophical framework is actually Marxism. And after a few years of attending these trainings and just the same themes repeated and nothing productive as far as improving human potential and really reading the authors and getting into the work, I realized oh, it really is. So I tried to have conversations with colleagues about, hey, we really need to examine our tools. We need to look at what we're promoting, what the whole system is promoting. And I was essentially like shunned, uh, pushed aside, and not engaged with. And also, I really, I'm promoting human dignity is one of the baselines ideas that I'm trying to promote. Uh, and that idea has met a lot of resistance, and people are triggered and alerted and sent into high active emotional states when confronted with the notion of human dignity, when confronted with that if we can see each other as we see ourselves, we're less likely to do harm, and this notion that we do have different cultures, there are differences, but we also have a shared humanity. We have a shared history as a species, and we are in this moment right now where we are planning for a shared future.
Wait,
So
you've
those
got
ideas that I just went through are really alerting to a growing number of people, and those growing number of people are all ones that believe in the successor ideology. And the successor ideology operates, repressive tolerance is one of its tools and one of its modus operandi.
I've got to ask, like, I don't understand how the word human dignity can be triggering. What is it about human dignity that is means something else? I mean, how is it
I,
being interpreted that it in the negative?
I feel it all depends on what happened to your software. You know, what obviously those people that believe that and feel that way, they have put different things into their brains. They've read different people, they've had different things explained to them. That's the only I don't know what it is because conversations never happened. But for people to have such a strong reaction against that, their information system receives something that rejects it, and I don't
It,
know what that is.
it might be. I mean, mostly when people think of or hear about Marxism, they think of economics, right? They think of class divisions between the haves, right, the bourgeoisie, the have-nots, the proletariats. And I think what's transpired over the in more modern times is what some people might call like a neo-Marxism or a cultural Marxism, where instead of the rich against the poor, it's more like the BIPOC versus the white, right? Black, indigenous, people of color versus white, or cisgender versus transgender, or men versus women, or able-bodied versus the people with disabilities, right? Everything, it's like instead of pitting the classes against each other, that didn't work in the United States. That's what the Frankfurt School realized: is you can't pit the bourgeois against the proletariat in the United States, because there's a strong middle class. It definitely was in the 40s and 50s when they were trying to get this idea, going here. So then they started looking at the social classes versus the economic classes, and they found that was really ripe territory for these divisions. And so if you can break people down into people of color versus white people, and cisgender people and transgender people, what do you mean then when you talk about the human being, right? If we're broken down by races and ethnicities, then you can't say human race anymore, right? So maybe human dignity, maybe that's touching on this pushback against talking about the human being. No,
Yeah.
I'm not a human being. I'm a transgender, Hispanic, you know, man, blah blah. Like I have to be broken down. I'm not just a human being. I'm a particular kind of human being with all of my unique intersections.
Mhm. Okay, so what I'm hearing, and let me make sure that I heard you right. One of the problems with human dignity, where it might be upsetting to people, is because it touches on, and I've talked about this lately, it touches on individualism. And individualism has kind of become almost a right wing word, a bad word. And did I understand that right? You can't have human dignity, because human dignity entails that you, as a person, as a singular entity, is deserving of it.
I mean, yes, but no. If you think about like intersectionality, how can it not be individualistic? Right? Like if each individual is made up of their own unique intersections, that's also individualistic. But what happens is they take it out of the individual and say like, well, which one of those intersections, which one of those affinity or affiliated groupings that you belong to, like which one is the most oppressed, and so you join that group, versus recognizing like, oh, I'm a unique individual because I'm made up of a different race and ethnicity and class and religion and social standing and education level and ability status. Like it, in my view, that's all individualism.
No, I hear
But
you.
it's not used that way. It's not utilized, or it's not treated as an individualistic viewpoint. I don't understand how, but it gets broadened out to the affinity group, to the social class.
And another reason why that dignity model could be rejected is if that really becomes, if that is the lens, then it completely dissolves power. If we are truly to able honor dignity, then it's the ultimate equalizer. It erodes power, it erodes ego, it increases our ability to help each other when we see each other in need. It completely crushes the narrative, because people will no longer be in conflict with each other. People will no longer clamor for power, clamor for glory, try to elevate themselves above others by clinging to an intersectionality label. Because that's one of the things now is with this narrative, you can find one of these groups and ascend in status and power. And dignity knocks the legs out of that stool.
Okay, that's really fascinating. I'm taking.
Can I add one more piece
yes,
to that?
Please.
Right. If you think of like the denotative, the definition of dignity, like in a dictionary kind of way, right? It's a sense of being valued and respected, right, as a person. And so you treat people with dignity. You want people to treat you with dignity. As a social worker, treating people with dignity is foundational to our code of ethics. I think what happens is I think there's an effort on some individuals or some groups to deny dignity to some people while demanding it of other people, because it's sort of like you've had too much dignity or something. It's like you don't deserve dignity because you and your people historically have been horrible or something like that. And so it's a denial, right? So I think we're just touching on people. I think part of it also is this redefining of terms that happens, right? It's like it doesn't matter what a dictionary says anymore, because some group is going to say, well, that's not what that word means anymore. And it's like, well, who decided that? Since when? Yesterday, right? And so if dignity means, if dignity is an inherent value, something that as a social worker I'm supposed to recognize and acknowledge and extend to my clients and patients, well, is that only some of my clients and patients? Is that all of them? Is that, like, I don't know how to draw the line on dignity. Am I supposed to draw a line on dignity?
You guys are blowing my mind. Okay, I want to make sure again. I'm repeating what you're saying to make sure I understand it. Yeah, both of you guys. I mean, dignity because it's individual. Everyone has dignity. It dissolves power, and you find power in groups. Did I get that? Did I make that connection right? And so these identities, these group identities that we have, are what's giving us power, and therefore dignity is a threat because it might actually make everyone equal.
I think that's a good summation.
Isn't that
Yeah.
oh my God, the fact that we're all fighting for equality and something that might actually make some people equal is now something that is a threat because of power.
Well, because equality is not the goal of the person who is putting forward a repressive tolerance point of view. It's equity, not equality. So equality is what a classical liberal, right, is wanting to espouse and live and see put forward the idea of equality. But in nowadays it's equity, which is different, right? Because equality is having access to opportunities in as fair a way as possible. Equity is making sure that we all have the same outcomes.
And I
And
see that.
that's not going to work. That means if you're in track and field, the slowest runners get to start ahead of you.
Yeah. And so where we see that in our culture, equal outcomes is an idea that they are pushing forward. So this idea of equal outcomes of all students, equal outcomes of all people, that idea is currently being pushed through the culture. Now, in order, the three of us have three very different lives, and in order for make us all of our outcomes the same, you're going to have to limit us. You're going to have to limit us creatively. You're going to have to limit us, like, really, in order to do equal outcomes, you have to have tyranny. There's no other way except for tyranny to enforce and ensure equal outcomes, because it's equal outcomes among everybody. And since the successor ideology is not just a United States thing, it's it's a worldwide phenomenon. So
I mean, just think about it in higher education, right? The opportunity to get accepted into a doctorate program, right? That's not easy to do, and then to write a dissertation. That's, I mean, my understanding, I only have 3 master's degrees. I never went that next step on, right? My understanding is that the process by which a person goes through writing a dissertation, it makes you or breaks you. I've heard it's just treacherous. So let's think about like how difficult, how arduous, how that process is. And some people are going to be like, yeah, you've got to go through that arduous process. Other people, what are they going to do? They're going to be assigned a team of 10 people who help them write their dissertation, right? It's like so that everybody gets a doctorate, you know. And so some people are going to need all this extra help, and it's like, well, then it devalues a doctorate.
and a way you could do that is you just do away with doctorates.
Well, that's true too. Yeah.
So, okay, I was going to ask you something on the Marxist, but I think from what you guys said, I now understand. But let me spell it out for you. You were talking about how a lot of what's being taught is Marxist philosophy, and I was going to ask you about that, but I think you answered it in the equal outcomes, right? So when I understand Marxism, and as a China scholar, what I've seen happen in China with the communist revolution there is it was that attempt to forcefully create these equal outcomes. Is that when we're talking about equal outcomes, is that what you are talking about when you say Marxist philosophy? Yeah, okay.
That, and this notion that there is no individual. Each human is either an oppressor or an oppressed.
So
Like that's also that.
I mean, I want to be clear. I'm not a Marxist scholar. I'm not an expert in Marxism. It's just, I went to college in the 90s, and so that, there was a lot of postmodernism in the teachings at that point in time. So I learned it years and years ago. And in some ways, I think I just accepted it as truth because it was being put forward to me as truth. And it took years and years and years for me to kind of come to my senses and realize, wait a minute, a lot of these theories I learned in the classroom don't really apply in the real world. And it started when I went through my gender transition and realized that living as a man wasn't going to be like the best thing since sliced bread, like I thought, based on what I was taught.
I'm laughing right now because, I went to school in the 90s too, and I don't remember being taught this postmodernism, and I wonder if it was the Mad Dog 2020. Just throwing that one out there.
Well, I think it depends on your major too. I think,
yeah.
I was a social science major. I think that makes a difference.
I took a lot of sociologies and histories and political science.
Okay.
So it was kind of presented to me as, this is what we do.
So I had the exact opposite experience because studying China, all we did was study the Cultural Revolution and the Chinese Revolution. And so much of what I see now, and I'm reading Kenny Xu's book now, The Inconvenient Minority. And he's talking, in the first few chapters, he's talking about China and he's talking about this, equal outcomes and the destruction that wrought. And so when you started talking about Marxist philosophy and then put out this, equal outcomes, that's when it kind of came together for me. But I've got another question around that. So you had mentioned, before when we were talking about Marxism, Zander, you were talking about this, that we were really talking about class. And now we've expanded it to so many other binaries or so many other identities. Do you think that one of the attractions to this Marxist philosophy perhaps is the inequalities of class, where we had a strong middle class, like you said, 40s, 50s, we had a strong middle class, and that started to get pulled apart, where we've got more division in terms of class? Is it possible that Marxist philosophy, in some ways, that gave it a space to bubble up?
Oh, absolutely. I think they took full advantage of recognizing that there were inequities in all different areas that had to do with people's access, right? Women's access to the working world, and Black people's access to whatever, right? And depending on where they were living, and as a Hispanic person, like, has Hispanic people and Asian peoples, right? Like there have been inequities. I don't think anybody's saying there hasn't been. Interestingly enough, what I think can happen is we can be using the same words, or we can have a similar goal, because if you think about it, going from a class-based system of dividing people up to a cultural or social way of doing it, ultimately what it looked like it was meaning to do is create belonging. Right? It's like, we're going to have the gay people over here and the women over here and the Black people over here and the Native American or indigenous peoples over here, so that they can be part of their group. They can learn their history. That's right. That's when all these like Chicano studies and African American studies and women's studies, it's like, let's help them create a sense of belonging to their affinity group, to their racial group, to their ethnic group. And so like, I don't begrudge an interest in having a sense of belonging. It's just that when it gets to the point where I strongly affiliate and define myself by and feel belonging in this one group, and then it turns itself towards the other groups and says, because you don't accept me, you don't agree with me, you don't welcome me, I don't like you, you're evil. You know what I mean? Like, that's when it becomes destructive.
And when it becomes gameable. Like,
sure, yeah.
You can game this system. If there are aspects of my identity that I can change to get power. But if I outwardly express and say I'm this or I believe this, then I can not only get power, but I can also be really rude to other people. It gives me, if I align myself with looking at repressive tolerance, because that kind of justifies and sanctifies uh, treating people in undignified ways.
I mean,
So
yeah, it's like there are members of my community, right, as a trans man, that I feel like I can just be myself around them. I can relax. I can have just a regular conversation. I don't have to be careful with what words I use. It's like the sense of belonging, the importance of it can't be missed, right? We A sense of belonging is, but it's when it turns on the others. It's like
because
we
you're
can't.
also a transphobe, right, Xander?
Well, yeah, I've been called transphobic.
I mean, so that's another fallacy. That's another. So it kind of shows that this whole thing is absurd and its purpose for destruction, and that's all it is. I heard you say that there'll always be inequities, and there always has been. And one of the things that really caught my attention was the research on firstborn children.
Mm.
Uh, Usually, firstborn children end up being higher wage earners than their siblings. The percentage of firstborn that are CEOs and that are in leadership positions in their careers is disproportionate to second and third siblings. And these are people that share the same DNA as other human beings, were raised in the same household environment, and those people still have different outcomes in life. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's only children as well, right?
mhm.
And but what's really interesting is that, just thinking about it from the clinical perspective, if you have three siblings that are all raised by the same parents in the same home, they really had three very different experiences. And so
Mhm.
because the parents are changing and shifting and becoming more aware of things, and so like my wife, her and her sister are 7 years apart. They were raised by the same parents, not literally in the same physical house, but when my wife was growing up, her parents were graduate students. When her sister
Yeah.
was growing up, her parents were college professors. That's a very different
Mm.
upbringing. And so they have very different, views of the world and very different experiences in the world. And so it's like, but are they inequities or are they just differences? It's like, I know I don't know if it was a study, but I think in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, I think, or maybe Freakonomics, one of those books where
I love freaking out.
they were talking about how they were noticing that all of the like all-star players on a particular sporting team were all born in like the second half of whatever time of the year
Mhm.
that they pick people for the team. And it's like, yeah, they're all 12-year-olds, but some are like a month away from being 13 and some turned 12 a month ago. And there's a big difference in the musculature, in the maturity, in the height of those like 10 or 11 months when you're a kid. And so you've got all of these extraordinarily proficient, I don't remember if it was soccer or basketball. And she was noticing, I think it was his wife was noticing that they were all born in like this 1 or 2 month period of time, which makes them the oldest on the team that they were with growing up, right? There's teams that they were playing when they were kids. They were always ahead because they were always taller or faster or stronger.
That is Gladwell. Yeah, that's a great.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I've got another question for you guys. When we talk about this belonging and we see all the troubles with it and how we're talking about today, I mean, what are you guys doing differently? How do we do belonging well?
You can create a sense of belonging around values. shared values. What are, shared personal values? What are the values and mission of your organization? What are issues and what are things that are important to you? What do you want the future to look like? Zander, get
Yeah.
it. I'm gonna abruptly pass the baton. But those are, those are after we really break down what's happening, and then some of those ideas, and then Zander's technical side and everything else.
Well, I mean, I like what you just said, Jason, about because when I do my conflict management training for a large, federal healthcare system, I talk to them about how, you know, we all have different lives and we've all had different experiences and we all come to the understanding of things very differently. And yet we've been hired to be part of a system where the goal is um, excellent patient care. And so when we're having conflicts with people on our work team or in our workplace, it's always helpful for somebody to come in and remind everybody what the common goal and purpose is. Excellent patient care, um, you know, 365 days in a row without an injury on the job, like whatever it is, like to constantly bring it back to that, developing new products for to take to market, every month, or it's like keeping people focused on those larger, right, the meta dreams, the meta narratives, the meta um, goals and missions and values of the organization, because almost every organization has a mission statement. They have a vision statement. They have core values. And so when you bring in employees from across all these different social and ethnic and racial and all these other different kinds of affiliations and affinities, when you bring them together in a corporation, they can be realigned. It's like, as a veteran, when I served in the Coast Guard, right? You go into the military, they don't let everybody be an individual in that sense. You're there, you're on a mission, you have a mission. And there's a goal, and each branch of the military is completely different from the others, and people self-select into. So we're going to self-select into an employer that has a mission, a vision, a purpose that we can get behind. Why would we expect that we would go take a job somewhere and try and completely change the mission, the vision, and the purpose? And that's kind of what's happening. Is there's a deconstruction, right, of a national mission, vision, and goal and purpose, right? Like it'll be denigrated, right, as being nationalistic or US centric, but we are a nation and we are citizens of a nation. And so we have, like, the American dream. We do have these grander visions and ideals and purposes. How can we make it so that more people feel part of that,
Right.
versus demonizing the American dream? How can we make it more available? How can we make it so that people can see themselves in that dream?
How can we reform? And that's the key difference between classical liberalism and successor ideology, is that people in that classical liberal framework want to discuss, want to hash it out and make things better, and want to build. The other camp is just in a constant destruction mode.
Well, and we need it, right? We need everybody's input, because if we don't, then we're going to fall into the trap of groupthink. And when we fall into the trap of groupthink, that can be disastrous. It can be completely destabilizing for the individual. It can be disastrous, for the company. We don't want groupthink, and we're going to get into more and more groupthink if people don't feel safe bringing up a counter idea from whatever side it is, left, right, center. All of these things should be able to be expressed.
Even if the idea is, I like the yellow one and not the blue one, just to be able to say and express that counter counter thought. But ideally, I think in a liberal society, we want people of all backgrounds, of all skill levels, of all interests, of all viewpoints to develop themselves to their fullest potential and then come together in the working place with all of those skill sets to really solve the complex issues that need to be solving. If we can value every single one of those lives when we come together, and if we can get along when we do, then we can, and we know that we're reformers and builders, then we can use those institutions and environments to begin building up, and rather than the destruction mode that we're in.
I find that fascinating, but I'm interested in how it goes because recently Coinbase came out and they said, okay, we're not doing this politics stuff. We're not doing this identity stuff. We're here to work. We've got this corporate culture, what you guys are talking about. And I mean, they were slammed, they were slammed. And so there is this, what's crazy now that I'm understanding what you guys are talking about more, that our corporations have turned into their own identity groups. And if you even stray from that, like a Coinbase, I mean, they're still doing fine, right? Okay, so they're but when that came out that they were like, stop this, this is not, we're going to go on values of who we are. Holy crap! Like the Twitter sphere exploded.
We need more Coinbases, and I'm not just saying that because Empowered Pathways has wallets set up through Coinbase.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer. But we really need more people stepping up and saying that we're going to work. Since I've really come out as strongly supporting Western civilization and like, hey, I don't think we need to burn down the ground, I've met the most diverse group of people that I've ever encountered. So it's interesting to see that that's where real diversity is, whenever we get to the point of valuing the individual and allowing for that's where we ideally, I think that's where everybody would want to get to, but the successor ideology is putting structures and things in place that are preventing that. Not just preventing that now, but preventing future generations of human beings from experiencing what we got to experience.
I mean, it's, if I dial in just to me, my personal experience, well, I just turned 55. I never thought I'd live to be this old, right? I shouldn't be, in all intents and purposes, I shouldn't be alive, nor should I be as successful as I am. And why is that? Well, because supposedly I shouldn't be, because I'm Hispanic and I'm transgender. I'm just using that for this. I don't typically use that word, but for the purpose of the podcast, I'll use it. Like, those things should have been major barriers for me. I was also a group home kid, and I was in special education. I dropped out of high school. The teachers had very, very low expectations of me, and I ultimately dropped out of school when I stopped going to school in the 8th grade, and then I was institutionalized and through the group homes, and I was forced to do schooling, but I wasn't in public school. I was in some sort of like special school. And then I dropped out of high school, and then I went into the military after I got my GED. And it's like, supposedly, for all these reasons, nobody expected that I would go to college, that I would become, a professional. And not only did I become a professional, but then I became the highest award I could get in my profession, right? So it's like, I have superseded my own expectations, the expectations of my family, the expectations of society. And how did I do that? Like, how was I able to do that? It's like, well, I think it's, dogged determinism. I think I have a personality that is just oriented towards, I'm rebellious. right? I got a little bit of punk rock in me. I dress like a yuppie, but I've got the attitude of a punk rocker, right? It's like so there's something about, my father used to always say to me, you use your shortcomings, so to speak, as a ladder, not a crutch. So if somebody wants to give you a scholarship because you're Mexican, take it, but don't use it as a way to get out of doing things. Right. So I was raised, by a father who, came to this country as a young boy, went through the school system in Texas and Brownsville, and then joined the U.S. Marine Corps and became an engineer without a degree. I mean, that's a very difficult thing to do, especially in this day and age. So it was probably even more difficult to do it back when he did it. So there's a certain gumption and grit and perseverance that I have. I don't know where that came from. Right? Is it innate? Is it socialized? I don't know, but I'm so very happy. I'm so grateful that I have that, because I see people in my own community who are, they're just suffering under the weight of these low expectations because they believe it themselves. They believe it. They believe that the world is out to get them. They believe, they personalize and catastrophize, to use clinical terminology again, what's happening around them. Even if it's not happening to them directly, they expect that it will and assume that it is. And then, that's just so damaging to the psyche. It really, really is. And people live in a perpetual state of anxiety and depression and weariness, hopelessness, helplessness. That is no way to live. And it can't all be because the world is against me. Right?
And Zander, I want to hop on right now. So that is the purpose of this movement, is to break the individual. The philosophical root is to break the individual in hopes of utopia. And everything that you just described that is happening to people, the depression, the anxiety, the addiction, all of those things, those are examples of the social emotional impact that the movement is having on us. So once we address what's happening, then, and people can agree that, we're ready to start building up, then we can incorporate and do a lot of the metacognition training, the mindfulness, and really get into what do we need to do. Here's what we can do to cultivate the individual. Here's some 3 pathways of practice. Here are ways to interrupt thoughts and mindsets of fear and judgment and replace those with inquiry and compassion. So those are all the things that we are hoping, to provide as well. But what you just said really registered with me, because you listed the real effects and impact that we see in our world that the movement is having on the individual, because it was purposed to erode the individual, and it appears to be working on a societal level. And I just don't want to see that passed on to a younger generation.
I know what it feels like to be put into a system and broken down, right? That's what the military does. But it puts you back together stronger as a group, as a force, as a citizen, as a military branch, right? It puts you back together. I don't think they have any sense of putting people back together. They break them down, and then they say, everybody's out to get you. Good luck.
So that leads me to my last question for you guys. That was perfect, because you guys we're talking about belonging, we're talking about tolerance, and then you guys mentioned reconciliation.
Yeah.
So how do we get to the reconciliation where I think you're right, we've left people broken down. The suicide rates are off the charts. Granted, we had COVID, but even before pre-COVID, the suicide rates for young people have been off the charts and growing.
Well, and substance abuse. Yeah, cutting.
So how do we reconcile?
Well, I think what we have to first do is we have to recapture reconciliation from the cultural Marxists, right? Because they've turned this reconciliation, this idea of reconciliation, into a kangaroo court. They're like, we're going to call you in, and what that means is we want you to present yourself to a room where there's going to be some people who are going to tell you all the ways in which you have failed us, and you're going to sit and listen, and then we're going to come up with a plan for how you're going to remedy, right? How you're going to remedy these harms that you've caused. And the only reason I know that is because I've been invited very, very, very nicely. I've been invited to some reconciliation sessions. I've been called in by members of the larger trans community, of which I refuse to go because I know true reconciliation. I have a master's in conflict analysis and resolution. I took a semester-long course in reconciliation. I understand it from that perspective. I never lived in South Africa or other nations where they actually rolled out, but I know truth and reconciliation. It's not just reconciliation, it's truth and reconciliation. And the charges that are brought against people in these call-in kangaroo courts is not based in truth. And there's no redemption and there's no forgiveness. It's all just, you're a bad person or you've done really bad things and we want you to stop it. And that is not true reconciliation. Reconciliation is when people can come together, they can speak their truth about, this is how what you said or did impacted me, right? You see it in like victim offender mediation, which I've done in practice, right? It's like people come together and say, hey, when you vandalized my house, I was feeling terrified and betrayed, and the person who did the vandalizing, it has to listen. How did what I did impact that other person, right? And then the other person gets to hear like the really crappy life, most likely that person who did the vandalism lived, and then they figure out what is the restoration, right? What they come together with a path towards restoration, right? And so that's true. That's a true reconciliation process, and that's not how most people are using it these days. They're not talking about the truth component, and they're not talking about how we come together to restore the relationship between people, in the neighborhood, wherever it is.
Because without trust, an organization is not going to be able to work towards its mission. A school is not going to be, without that relational trust, whatever the goal or the objective is, it's not going to be achieved.
Well, and it's like and that's tantamount, right? It's like if you go to like a website, Great Place to Work, they rank companies and then they put them on, I don't know, Forbes or Fortune or something. What do they always come up with? Time and time and time again. What is one of the most critical components of what makes a workplace great? Trust. That's it. And so it's everything.
And
right?
If your colleagues are, if you have oppressors in your community, then there is no trust. So
we've actively broken down trust by the way we've dealt with belonging, would you say?
Yes.
In some cases, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Because when you said a few minutes ago, you said something about how Twitter went crazy when Coinbase made its public statement. It's like my first reaction to that is, who cares? Who cares what Twitter says? Right? But people do care. It's like, how many people was that? Was it 1,000? Maybe less? It's not that many people, but they're very loud and they're very mean. And so people get afraid. They're like, oh, I don't want my shareholders to get mad, or I don't want my family to get mad, or I don't want people to think I'm a bad person. So they react instead of respond. What they should do is with Scott Adams. I like Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert. He has this, I think it's called like the 48-hour rule, where when something outlandish is said in the media, like so-and-so is a racist and they lied, sort of like when Roseanne Barr, and he said he's got this rule, I think it's 48 hours, where he waits to see what transpires over those 48 hours for all the truth to come out, and then he can go, okay, now let me look at it. It's not based on the Twitter mob, in the first 12 hours of something. That is not based in truth.
I love how cartoons sometimes, it's like, everything I learned about life I learned in kindergarten. Everything I learned from life I learned from Dilbert.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm laughing because I forgot my notebook in my room. And so, you know how they say, like, taking notes on the back of an envelope? Well, I've taken notes on the front and the back, and I'm going to have to, like, figure that out. Yeah, I'm going to have to figure that out later. It's so good to speak with you guys. Thank you so much for, I mean, you guys blew my mind over and over again. I'm just going to repeat some of the favorite things that I heard. Use your shortcomings as a ladder, not a crutch. Love that. And then I love the idea. I'm sorry, I'm flipping back and forth from which side of the envelope did I write this on? And dignity, Jason, for you, dignity dissolves power and ego and crushes the narrative. And so I think what you're doing in the world is just, I mean, it's kind of mind blowing.
Well, just, I'm just trying to do something different and do something productive. I got tired of using ineffective tools that were purposed for destruction. And I know there's a lot of other people out there as well that are ready to begin building up and doing something different. So I want us, as an organization, to be able to provide that to people.
And to start that trust again. And I think that, yeah, where, and that trust starts with people who aren't afraid and don't, back down, where people go, oh, I can rely on that person, where they're not, one day saying this thing and the next day apologizing for it, which is very common in our.
I mean, part of what I do, as an independent contractor, I not only teach people mindfulness practices and emotional distress tolerance and how to get a good night's sleep, right? Like that's some of what I do, but I also do diversity education. I can go into a space and I can talk about diversity, but I talk about it in a way that's different from when I go into a boardroom or a conference room or on Zoom to do diversity education. I do it as an educator, not an activist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I find out, like, what are the issues that are going on here? I want to see I go on the web and what's your mission statement? What's your vision statement? What do you primarily do here? What do you call your employees? I want to build rapport with them, and I want to find a way to find out, what do they love about what they're doing? And it's called Appreciative Inquiry. It's a particular consulting model where you find out, like, what do people appreciate about their company? What do people enjoy about their job? And you find out about that, and then you work towards cultivating more of that. You don't focus on the negative, you focus on the positive. Appreciative inquiry.
Appreciative inquiry. Okay.
Yeah. So that I do my educating around diversity from an appreciative lens rather than a critical lens.
Right, because everyone, I think, loves diversity. Diversity isn't the problem. It's the way we're teaching around diversity. That's the problem.
Well, and what we value.
Right.
This version of diversity values skin color,
Mm-hmm.
the way that you love, and whatever other biological gifts that God gave you. Mm-hmm. Like that's what diverse. It's not about what we think, what we believe, what our skill set is. Diversity of skill set, diversity of competent. Like all of those, diversity of character strengths. Pull from everybody. It's not that. It's about just those inherent traits that we're born with. Or if I can say, oh, I'm tired of being treated like the oppressor, so I'm going to now go find one of these other groups. At least find another group as my day job, and come home and just be a normal, just be old regular old Jason.
Regular old.
We like regular old Jason.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's just something to say about, you know, what somebody, right? It's like, I think, wasn't it in the movie The Secret? Remember that book and that movie The Secret? Do you remember that from maybe the early 90s? And they were talking about, when they talk about brain plasticity, and it's like this idea of, if you focus on something, right, it becomes real, right? You can imagine
Mm-hmm.
you can imagine an atrocity, and your brain sends chemicals and signals to your body as if that thing is really happening. And so I think that that's what's happened, is people have been convinced that they're living in some sort of like cultural Armageddon, and that they need to, like, tool up, without guns, of course, because guns are bad, but they need to tool up with their words to fight the oppressor. And it's like it's as if they're on guard and looking for it at every turn. How are you supposed to live a life if you are watching and waiting, like you're on the watchtower waiting for the enemy to approach at any minute? Like that I mean, that's what people with post-traumatic stress,
Mm-hmm.
that's how they live. And we call that a condition that needs to be treated and perhaps medicated. So it's almost as if we have like a societal post-traumatic stress from people telling other people, bad things are happening to you. You just need to open your eyes to see it. The microaggressions,
It's so funny that you said that, because Jason and I have spoken about this before. When people throw around the term post-traumatic stress disorder around these emotional things, and some of it's valid. I don't want to discount where it's not, but you as well, Zander, as someone who's former military, my family's former military. My husband's in law enforcement, and that's a real thing. It's a real, and so we've co-opted that term that moves from a true battlefield to an emotional battlefield. And I think a lot of it is because of what we keep telling ourselves, like you said. So I mean, it's become a real thing, but it kind of frustrates me sometimes the way that we use that, as it's just like as a cold, as if you have a cold. I have post-traumatic stress syndrome. I got a cold today.
Well, it's this really interesting thing that a person who has been in combat or experienced military sexual trauma or non-military sexual trauma like rape, they can have, not all, but they can have post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, some people call it. But I know people who get misgendered and they say they have post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's like, I mean, maybe, but then there needs to be a spectrum, of differentiating between post-traumatic stress from combat and sexual assault versus somebody calling you the wrong pronoun.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no equivalency there in my mind.
Right.
It's almost like it's a way to claim victimhood status. Like if you can call PTSD and whatever you can cling to it, you're ascending into some sort of power by claiming victimhood.
I mean, I get it, right? If a person is saying, right, from the trans perspective, if a person is saying misgendering me impacts my ability to feel like I belong, right? An accepted member of society. So I get it. But it's that elevation of now I might kill myself as a result of it. Like it just escalates. And I think there should be interventions rather than holding individuals up as like, see, here's evidence of how bad it is. I think we just need to employ intervention strategies to teach people how to navigate through that distress of people misgendering you. I know what that feels like. It's happened to me. I went through it as an androgynous female for like 25 years. I got called sir all the time. I found it really unsettling, but it didn't escalate to a certain point. It's like, maybe it can't be because my earlier life was like, silver spoon. I was in a group home, for God's sake. That tells you something about my earlier life. So there's got to be something that we can do to intervene to provide people with the skills, the mindfulness skills, the challenging the negative thoughts, so that people can when we talk about self-care and self-advocacy and self-efficacy, these are things that we can teach people. They're not innate. We can teach these things. This is part of social emotional learning, which is what we're doing at Empower ED Pathways.
Yep, and teaching that resiliency.
Yes, it's all part of it.
Yep. All right, well, thank you guys so much. Cheers to both of you.
Cheers to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.